do you have more clarity on how the elections are going to impact the FX space?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of overall, we would argue that there's obviously going to be uncertainty ahead of elections. I think there's a number of questions about whether the U.S. election would even be recognized by the president or even the Democrats. I mean, clearly, there's a lot of uncertainty that's likely to build up. Polls obviously clearly still show some lead for the Democrats and Biden. But what I'm just trying to get at here is if this uncertainty persists, it could weigh negatively or more negatively on the dollar. Dollar's had a bit of respite in recent days, but it could be just a bit of a short covering rally rather than any sustained bounce. So I suspect the dollar's going to come under renewed pressure in the next several months, and therefore currencies that we mentioned like the RMB and probably a number of other emerging market currencies are going to do reasonably well out of that if the dollar continues to remain under this sort of degree of pressure. And we're already seeing that in some of the high carry emerging market currencies, which are doing pretty well in this environment. I think that could continue in the next few months.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the outperformers, Mitul, but that dollar weakness hasn't exactly lifted all of EM. In fact, we see, I guess, most of EMFX that is still struggling right now. What do you think is driving this weakness, and what can really spark a turnaround?
Well, I think one of the reasons why a number of EM currencies haven't moved as strongly as you would have expected, given the weakness in the dollar, is simply central banks have been intervening to prevent currencies from strengthening. We know that emerging markets are under a huge degree of pressure. They don't have the same fiscal and monetary capacity to boost activity as some of the developed economies. And the fact is that the currency is still quite a big tool in many, especially in Asia, where the region is still very export orientated. So keeping currencies to some extent suppressed against even a weaker dollar is a means of trying to boost competitiveness and exports. I think that's one reason why we haven't seen emerging market currencies benefit. But also, and I kind of alluded to this, the fact that growth pressures are not going to be dealt with as quickly and COVID infections are still rising dramatically in some countries, for example, India, means that there has been less inflows back into emerging markets in recent months, and that's meant that EM currencies have not been able to benefit. And I think for now that cautiousness is going to continue before we see any real rally in emerging market assets.
Mitul, switching focus to Europe, we've got the ECB meeting later this week. Is there anything they can do to tame the euro strength?
Well, I mean, I think aside from jawboning, it's very difficult to see what the ECB is going to do. It's very unlikely they're going to act further on policy. I think we've already seen a number of the policy levers already having been pulled. We may see Lagarde, ECB president, highlight some of the flexibility of the PEPP, perhaps suggesting that the pace of buying will pick up in response to the downbeat inflation outlook. But as for the euro, it's highly unlikely they're going to be saying much or doing much, apart from sort of talking the currency lower, as we saw last week from a couple of ECB officials. So I don't think we're going to see any significant action on the euro.